Good late afternoon. This is Critical Talk with Professor Amin D, and I have my favorite political science, public policy, American foreign policy buddy on the screen back with us again. And tonight, I thought it was critical to talk about U.S. policy in the Middle East and North Africa. As you can hear, my voice is terrible, so I'm going to rely a lot on Dr. Hibbert to give us a lesson. Dr. Hibbert is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at DePaul University in Chicago. He has taught at DePaul since 2005. He teaches courses on American foreign policy, international relations, Middle East policy, and religion and politics, among others. He has also taught at the American University in Cairo and at Swarthmore College. Uh, Dr. Hibbert has loads of awards, but let me just say that he worked in the U.S. government serving as a program officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace and as a legislative staff member at the U.S. Congress. He is the author of Religion and Politics and Secular States and a co-contributor of Islamic activism and U.S. foreign policy. He also co-edited the Introduction to Islam in the 21st Century. And with that, I'm going to welcome Dr. Hibbert again. He will be our standby for all things political uh, because I can't stretch my mind that far. So, one of the things I said earlier, and you gave me a better phrase for it, is how domestic policy drives foreign policy. And I think at this time, we're so caught up in our domestic stuff that we forget that there's that other half going on until you say something like foreign students can't come to U.S. colleges unless they go get COVID.
Amen. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on again, Emma. Nice to see you. Nice to be here. So I figured I would just begin by just saying a few words about, kind of the outlines of American foreign policy in the Middle East, and then we can kind of talk about specific regions and we can see where the conversation goes. But, historically, there have been kind of three driving principles, if you will, of American foreign policy. Access to the region's resources, i.e. oil, has always been paramount, going back to 1945. Protecting our allies has been central to that, and not just Israel, but the Gulf monarchies, and then Egypt and other countries. And then the third issue is containing rivals. In other words, containing the influence of rival states. So during the Cold War, that meant keeping the Russians or the Soviet Union out of the Middle East. And in more contemporary times, it means keeping China, Iran, Russia from having undue influence in the region. And again, what a lot of this really boils down to from a geostrategic perspective is that as long as the world economy runs on oil, having a control of that resource and being able to turn it off in a moment of crisis gives whatever state that controls that an undue influence in international politics. And so again, going back to 1945, this has been the centerpiece of American foreign policy is access to the region's resources, and it's one of the reasons why we've been so close with Saudi Arabia for so many years. We provide them security; they provide us cheap oil. That oil has helped rebuild Europe after World War II. It helped solidify our hold on the international economy for many years, and that's that has been the bulwark of American foreign policy again from 1945 to the present. Now, one caveat on all this. With the Trump era, the region has really been scrambled, or American foreign policy has been scrambled, and I'll hold off on that part of the equation for a minute.
How I hear so much in that. Let me go back. Can you do a kind of a long view? Because the tendency is to think that the U.S. has always been a power grabber.
Okay.
And that we disrupt regimes, legitimate regimes, that we pay people off.
Yeah.
We do all this stuff.
Yeah. So, okay, let me respond to that with two answers or two approaches to this. First was going to be the more long-term historical. That if you look at the regional order, I mean, it was really developed. It was built, if you will, by the French and the British after World War I, coming out of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which helped kind of provide the framework for the development of the states that we now look at as the modern Middle East, and the map of the region was then. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, the European powers are decimated, they're in retreat, and the U.S. really steps in as kind of the purveyor of order in the region. And so from in 1945 to, I would argue, till 2003, the U.S. was actually a very status quo power.
A long time.
Yeah.
Okay.
We were all about the status quo. We just wanted everything to stay the same. Now, we did terrible things because this was the Cold War, and we were overthrowing a democratically elected government in Iran in 1953. We were backing different regimes that served American interests. There's a sordid history there.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, what the United States foreign policy was really trying to do was just to maintain stability, to maintain the regional stability, maintain the free flow of oil at a reasonable cost, and to maintain our friends in power. And this is one of the reasons why we did everything we could to get rid of Gamal Abdel Nasser after the Kennedy era, and why we
tell people where Nasser was.
Yeah, so Gamal Abdel Nasser was the president of Egypt in the early post-independence period. He came to power in 1952 or 54, depending on how you really want to phrase it. But he represented kind of a secular modernist vision of pan-Arab nationalism in the 1950s and 60s, and he was seen as a communist. I mean, for all practical purposes, that's the way the CIA looked at it. I mean, because all those reformers, Jawaharlal Nehru in India, Nasser in Egypt, Castro in Cuba, all these reformers were leftist, and they were embracing socialist, economic policies. But from the American foreign policy perspective, we saw them as or I should say, within certain elements of like the CIA and the Defense Department, they saw them really as communists. And this was a big debate within the American foreign policy community back in the day. Are they reformers, or are they outliers or revolutionaries? And at the time, we had basically made our bed with or made our alliances with the conservative monarchies of the Persian Gulf, and they were deathly afraid of Nasser because Nasser had a big military, he had charisma, he had the Arab populations behind him, and so everyone saw him as the revolutionary. You could overthrow the regional order and operate in a manner that would be detrimental to American interests. And that's why a good chunk of American foreign policy during that period was directed at containing.
What were American interests?
Oil, protecting our regional allies, not just Israel, but the Persian Gulf monarchies, and containing the influence of other states. And the concern then, back in the day, was that Nasser was under the control of the Soviets. And if you know anything about Arab history or anything about Egyptians, that nobody tells them what to do. But Nasser did, reach out to the Soviets because he needed their help in building his state, keeping control of power, and keeping the Americans at bay, and basically keeping the European powers from overthrowing him, which almost came to pass in the 1956 Suez Crisis, which we don't need to get into. But it's a long way of saying that, again, if you look at that historical time period, we looked at the region through the lens of communism and the Cold War. We weren't looking at it through the lens of what do the populations of the region need to really develop. And I would argue that that's been sort of the fatal flaw of American foreign policy from that period to the present, that we've always looked at the region through an ideological lens. We've always looked at the region as a source of our oil, a source of resources. And we haven't really looked at the region in terms of like what it really needs to develop. And as a result, we've backed regional powers that are corrupt, authoritarian, and and as they commonly say, the extremism of these countries is bred in the torture cells of of different autocratic governments.
Well, when we're thinking policymakers like yourself, why aren't these sovereign nations permitted to just develop in their own time and space, just like we did?
Amanda, that's a very good question. So part of it again kind of comes back to like an ideological framework of how we view the world, or at least how American foreign policy has historically viewed the world. And again, during the Cold War, it was really seen as us and them, this titanic struggle between the U.S. and the Soviets, and everything was kind of viewed through that lens. Now, there's another part of it too, of interest, that there's money to be made in terms of allowing oil to, or keeping our friends in power who will promise to sell oil to us, cheaply. Not just sell oil to us, but sell to us, cheaply. And I say us, I'm talking about the West and the Western, economic structure. But also it's also keeping out of power, people that we see as inimical to our interests or to American interests. And this is why one of the challenges has always been that whenever you have a reformer, or kind of jump ahead, if you look at like the Arab uprisings of 2011, the first thing that goes through everyone's minds is, oh my gosh, is this a revolution that's going to bring the Islamists to power? And they're going to cut off our oil. It's going to displace our friends. It's going to, and this is a challenge. And this is really where our values and our interests are continually in conflict. And there's always this tension about what really drives American foreign policy. Is it democracy, or is it oil and interest? Those are, and this is one of those regions where our interests have historically trumped our values, and we're willing to back autocratic regimes that continue to maintain an inequitable status quo where the few benefit at the expense of the many.
So, just for the sake of us students who are listening closely, what is socialism?
Okay, so during the Cold War, there were two models of economic organization. There was free market policies that go along with capitalism, and the idea is that economic decisions are best made by individuals, not by states. Socialist planning was premised on the idea that the economy is too important to leave to individual capitalists. That what we need is some kind of state-led direction, and we need state intervention in the economy to ensure that it works well, and ensure that the fruits of everyone's labor are equitably distributed, not concentrated in the hands of a few. And also, from a nationalist perspective, we want to use the national resources to develop our societies. And this was particularly pertinent in the aftermath of World War II and the post-independence period. And this is one of the reasons why people loved Gamal Abdel Nasser, because he was going to say, hey, if we're going to take the money that we have, that we generate as a society, and we're going to invest it in education and healthcare, and we're going to take care of our people. And that would have been great if he would have had some oil. and this is like one of the areas.
How is that different than Social Security, Medicare, welfare, and all,
Yeah. So in reality, every economy has a mixed economy of some sort.
Yeah.
There's the outliers of the Soviet Union, but even if you look at England, you look at France, you look at the U.S., there's always been a mixed economy, and part of the reason why we have a mixed economy, where you have a certain amount of government intervention in the economy and certain social safety nets that were established to kind of keep the the poorest from falling through the cracks. A lot of that really came out of the Great Depression, and the idea that how do you save capitalism? And Franklin Roosevelt, many people saw him as a traitor to his class, but part of the New Deal was to try to stave off violent communist revolution. Labor unions were there were major strikes in the 20s and in the 30s, and part of the creation of the social safety net was to allow for incremental reforms take care of the working classes, and try to give people a stake in the system. And that's where Social Security comes from. It's where welfare or food stamps or all that stuff comes from. But what's interesting is in the basically from the 1980s onward, you see us, and by the way, England and France and pretty much all those countries had some kind of mixed economy.
Right.
But from the 1980s onward, there was a systematic effort to promote what we refer to as neoliberal economic policies, which systematically dismantled a lot of these, a lot of the social safety nets. Not entirely, but try to cut back on the part of the economy that the government controls, either through regulation or through taxation or what have you. And so a lot of the 1980s and 90s was a conscious effort to push control of the means of production, control of the economy, control of wealth into the hands of private individuals. And I mean, all societies have done that. Egypt is the case I know best because I've lived there for some time. But the interesting thing about this is, at the end of the day, the way in which a lot of those policies worked out, those neoliberal economic policies, it really exacerbated the divide between the haves and the have-nots. And you see this in our society.
You're going to have to go back and explain new, liberal, nice policy.
Yeah, so neoliberal economic policies are basically the policies that were developed in the 1980s and 90s to privatize and deregulate large sectors of the economy. So in England, for example, there was this massive period of nationalization after World War II. Well, during the Thatcher era in the 1980s, you had a privatization process. So many things like the coal mines and waterworks and things were privatized. You see something very similar happening in Egypt in the probably 90s. There's an effort of privatization. And and a lot of this happened in the aftermath of the end of the Cold War in Russia. Now, privatization is not necessarily a bad thing, and the question is, how does one do it? And what you saw happen in places like Egypt as well as Russia is people with connections to power, people with connections to the power establishment, to the security services. They get loans from the government. They buy whole sections of the economy, and they give kickbacks to the ruling class. And so what you go from having a private or a public sector monopoly to basically a private sector monopoly. And one of the big rallying cries, if you will, of the Mubarak era, or of the Arab uprising in 2011, was concerned. Well, first it was all about Mubarak must go, but part of the reason why people felt Mubarak must go is there was so much corruption, in the ruling circles. And there was friends of the Hosni Mubarak's children who owned huge segments of the steel industry. And
I read.
Yeah, and if you're going to build any kind of construction in Egypt, requires steel. So you're just talking about a huge ATM or a huge source of income. And so again, one of the challenges of the region of this country are these economic policies that concentrate wealth in the hands of a few, and that generates a certain amount discontent, and that economic deprivation is readily translated into political discontent, and that's really what we see kind of unfolding in 2011. And by the way, I would argue that there are a lot of causes behind 2011, but I think a lot of it really did have a lot of it had to do with with economic inequity. And political corruption. The two are very much tied together. Part of the reason how you maintain control of the means of production of a given society is through a pervasive security apparatus.
Okay, I asked for this map.
Yes.
Because even I forget where stuff is. I want to go to the outer regions.
Yeah.
And work my way back across over to Morocco.
Okay.
So,
yeah. Go on.
So if I go up top, we still are tipping around Afghanistan.
Yeah.
What the hell are we still doing in Afghanistan?
It's the place where empires go to die, and we haven't been able to get out of there. If there's another map I should have sent you, which actually, if we just go over to Iran, if you think about the region, and again, this gets back to what I was talking about earlier, is if you think about the region, roughly 60% of the world's proven reserves of oil are in the region, and they lie underneath 5 countries: Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. So if you just think about that region right there, just really concentrated in that Persian Gulf region, there's like $30 trillion worth of oil. Now, you look at go across the region: Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and up into Syria and Turkey. They don't have, I mean, there's some oil, some gas, natural gas, Syria and Libya, but not the kind of wealth that you see in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Iran and Iraq. But the interesting part is the other areas is really where the demographic weight of the region is. So if you think about where most of the people live, it's Egypt, it's Turkey, it's Syria. And the other kind of interesting twist to this, if you think about the old powers and the traditional centers of civilization, Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, Istanbul, they're marginal in terms of where the wealth is today. I mean, they're still, have the demographic weight, but they don't have, the resources. That's now really Riyadh, Tehran, Kuwait City, UAE, Qatar. And so what's interesting is where the population centers are separated from where the wealth is. And this contributes to that same kind of bifurcation and in terms of wealth, within a population. But I'm talking about a region-wide population at this point. And so again, and now I'll see if I can dig up this map and send it off to you. But that's one of the kind of historical twists that comes out of the founding of the modern Middle East, is that you have the population centers largely separated from the resources. And there's a great article by a guy named Ian Lustig, who wrote back in the 1990s that I signed in my Mideast politics class, that talks about part of the reason why you have the stunted development of the region is precisely because anytime there was a regional power that really could have taken over large sections of it, and kind of combined the resources with the populations, Western powers consistently intervened, whether it was Muhammad Ali in 1820s or Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1950s or Saddam Hussein in the 1990s. In each of those instances, you had a militarily powerful state trying to take over, the hinterland, less populated regions, which would have, kind of made a more functional great power. But for a variety of reasons, largely because of imperial interest or great power interest, the Western powers consistently intervened to keep that from happening.
But if we look at this map,
yes,
we have that's Western. Okay, Pakistan and its ongoing communication with Afghanistan, but it shares a border also with Iran.
Yes.
Then when we come to further west, going to your left for the viewing audience, we have Iraq, which is, well, it's not as tiny as Syria, but Syria is sitting between Turkey, Iraq, and Jordan.
Yeah.
With this little sliver of Israel, which is trying to control everybody.
Yeah. Well, so Israel's historically had, the backing of the United States, but they've, and other outside forces, originally the French, the British as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they've always been a military force far outweighing their demographic weight. And there was only 7-8 million Israelis,
right,
not counting the Palestinian population in the mix. But they have the foremost military in the region, and anytime they fought wars, they've won them, even against much larger adversaries such as Gamal Abdel Nasser. And a lot of that was technological innovation, and it's it's contributed to kind of a militarization of the society because everyone goes into the military, and but they've also developed nuclear weapons with the aid of the United States, and that serves as a deterrent for for anybody attacking them.
Okay. I gotta jump around because my questions jump around.
Okay.
Syria.
Yes.
Talk to me about Syria. It's a little bitty dot.
Yeah. So Syria. I mean, there's a long history there that goes back to the French interest in the aftermath of World War One. But I think probably the most important thing to think about in terms of Syria today is it was a very unstable society all throughout the the politics of Syria were very unstable throughout the 1950s.
Why?
Coups. Well, in large measure, because of the same reason Iraq was and other countries, that you didn't really have these. You can't really call them nation states, right?
Okay.
Before 1918, there was no such thing as an Iraqi or a Syrian per se. I mean, these were all regions within the Ottoman Empire, and they were multi-ethnic, multi-religious. So you're not creating a state that is, ethnically homogenous.
Right.
Rather, you're creating a state with all kinds of different ethnic groups and religious groups, and many of them have long-standing animosities, and part of this was by design. If you look at Iraq, the north part is Kurdish, the eastern part is Sunni, the southern and eastern part is Shia. Historically, the Sunni parts the tribes had close ties with Sunni in Syria, Sunni in Jordan, Sunni in Saudi Arabia. The Kurds, of course, have connections to all the Kurdish populations in Turkey, Iran. I mean, the lines on the map don't reflect the demographic realities on the ground. And so that has created unstable states because you've got, and going back to Iraq, you've got Kurds and Shia and Sunni and different factions within them. They're vying for control. And that breeds authoritarianism because how do you actually, run a show, a strong state apparatus. And particularly during the Cold War, different external powers backed certain factions and, got them in place and provide them money and arms to kind of keep things in place. And Syria was very much the same. It was a very unstable society until Hafez al-Assad takes over, and he's from the Alawite community, which is a minority population, but they basically infiltrated the security services or became very pronounced in the security services, and so they were able to control power. But now you've got an Alawite minority ruling over a Sunni majority.
But the Alawites were originally a breakoff of Shia.
Exactly.
Right, okay.
Exactly. And so, so when kind of jumping forward to like the 2011 uprisings, when people are marching in the street calling for democratic reform, the same way people did in Tunisia, same way people did in Egypt, the ruling elite is not looking at it as the Syrian population is rising up for greater democratic accountability. They're looking at it as a Sunni uprising, targeting the Alawite and Christian minority populations.
Yeah.
So you can see very quickly why, from the regime's perspective, I mean, they were just their back was against the wall, and they do not hesitate to fire or use the military forces against the protesters.
Right.
They didn't have that same kind of empathy that, say, the Egyptian military had when they're seeing their Egyptian population in the streets. There was a sense in 2011 that you can't send the army in to shoot on these unarmed protesters because half the people in the military are these conscripts from Upper Egypt or from the Mbaba or different urban areas of Cairo. Their cousin's going to be on the other side of the barricade. They might actually take their guns and join them.
Yeah.
So, but again, that ethnic homogeneity doesn't exist. That one sees in Egypt. You don't see that elsewhere. And if you look at, again, where those countries that we fragmented in the aftermath of the 2011 uprisings, Libya, Syria, Yemen, they've had these historic divisions, either tribal or religious or ethnic or what have you. And so, the states which were held together through authoritarian rule fragmented, and now you have got these ongoing civil wars.
Okay, I'm going to drag you to.
Can I make two quick points before?
Oh, you can make three.
About context here. So, what's interesting, and I talk about this in my introduction to Middle East politics class, is if you look at, the region over the course of 100 years, you can see this kind of evolution of the state system.
Oh.
And but what's really fascinating is there have been two great shocks that have undermined the integrity of the system. And I would argue that what we see right now is the unraveling of the regional order. But the two shocks were the 2003 invasion of Iraq.
Yes.
The second one was the 2011 uprisings.
Okay.
The reason why I want to kind of key in on the 2003 invasion of Iraq is that it's really fascinating. I mean, just forget about the war and the war and the war.
George Bush, right?
George W. Bush.
Right.
But one of the things that's, I mean, from as a student of American foreign policy, it was such a sharp departure from the previous 50 years of American foreign policy. I mean, up until then, we were the ultimate status quo power. And in 2003, we changed, and we basically, or at least the George W. Bush administration, felt that they needed to reshape the regional order, largely because of the trauma of 9/11, but largely because this was an agenda that had pre-existed the 9/11 events. But the sense was, we need to radically reshape the regional order, and we're going to do this by, taking out Saddam Hussein, putting in a regional power or a leader that we can trust and will be our ally, and then we're going to use that opportunity to put pressure on the other what we refer to as backlash states or rogue states: Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, others.
Yeah.
That went terribly awry for any number of reasons.
Yeah.
Then you have the 2011 uprisings. Can
you let's start talking about that?
Okay. Well, but the kind of larger point is that those two shocks really began the process of unraveling, and they set in motion the civil wars that led to proxy wars. And I think that what we're seeing now is kind of a reshaping of the regional order. I'll take a step back and say just a word about the 2011 uprisings. There's been a lot written on it, and there's a lot of just really excellent literature out there. There's an individual named Herran Kamarava who wrote an edited volume that I like a lot. I've found some of his work in my classes. But the kind of punchline is there were a number of factors that drove the 2011 protest. One was, again, these deep inequities between the haves and have-nots. There was an economic crisis that was driven in part by globalization, but by other issues as well. But more to the point, what was interesting is you see the coming of age of a new generation, and that new generation wanted change. And what was interesting about the protests is they rallied around a very simple message, which was basically the regime must go, or Mubarak must go. Mubarak irhil, right? And because of that, you could get a very, very, very diverse, population behind a very simple message. And there was so much, and again, I'm oversimplifying because there were a number of various factors that went into the protest. In Egypt, in particular, there was a handful of cases of people being tortured to death.
Right.
An individual named, can't look at his name, Saeed, but anyway, who
Azidi? No, he was Libyan.
Khalid Saeed.
Yeah.
And but the thing is, there were what used to go on behind closed doors in a police state, where it was increasingly becoming evident through social media. So people being tortured in the police station,
right.
Khalid Saeed being beaten to death. A Facebook page is being created dedicated to his life and his death. Protests emerging around that, organization, kind of organic organization, emerging through social media. So you have a lot of factors going on. Economic inequity. These regimes have become kind of brittle. They've lost their legitimacy, and now you've got a very resurgent population, kind of calling for change. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, you also have an economic crisis that, the price of wheat like quadrupled on the world market, and it had a lot to do with climate change. There was fires in Russia, or forest fires in Russia, heat waves in Australia, destroyed.
Right.
And the thing is, like for you and I, or for you and me, I mean, the price of wheat or price of bread goes up $1 or whatever. But if you're living on, $3 a day or $4 a day, I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And the government's cutting back on the subsidies. And so the region really was a tinderbox. And you also had kind of a weakening of the state structures. And so all these things kind of came together, and you had the uprisings. Now, from a political science perspective, one of the things that we find really fascinating is you see the common phenomenon across the region, but you see different outcomes. And so from a political science perspective, you're always asking, well, how do you explain the commonality?
Right.
What's the common trend? But then you're also trying to understand what's the difference. Why did it play out differently in different societies?
So tell us.
Yeah, so a lot of it kind of boils down to what did the military choose to do? So in Tunisia, the military refused to fire upon the population.
Good.
In Egypt, they refused to fire upon the population. Both presidents were forced to leave. Now, again, there's a lot to the equation. Part of it had to do with a more professionalized military. In the case of Tunisia, I actually was at a conference and was talking to this a general in the Tunisian military. Fascinating guy. But his whole thing was, we're not political. We are the military. We're here to provide order. We're here to defend the country. We are not here to protect a bankrupt family. And the president fly to Paris to go shopping. That's we find that objectionable as well. Egypt, Egypt's very similar. There were splits in the ruling elite. There was concern that even though Mubarak was originally from the military, he was an Air Force general,
right?
That he was trying to pass the rule on to his son, the investment banker from London, Gamal Mubarak, and there was a sense that the interests of the military were being sold out. And so when you have all these people in the street protesting, saying the Mubarak must go, the military kind of puts their finger to the air and they're like, we see which way the wind's blowing. Yeah, sure. Boom, out the door. Now, they didn't ever relinquish control. It's a whole other side of the story, but they were willing to facilitate some kind of transition. Other countries, those popular protests degenerated very quickly into civil war. Again, Syria, Libya, Yemen. But what's interesting is you look at other places like Morocco, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. They led to actual reform or some kind of incremental reform. They were largely peaceful protests. They didn't spin out of control. Nothing really happened. Tunisia is probably the most interesting case of the lot, only because the transition is still going on, and they do have the most kind of democratic form of polity in the region. The one thing I've actually been watching recently is protests in Algeria, because the protests ironically in 2011, that's really where the protests started. There were bread riots in 2000, I think it was like December 2010, that then spread to Tunisia and elsewhere. But the Arab uprising or Arab Spring never really took off in Algeria for a variety of reasons. But in the last 2 years, there have been major protests, and they've been kind of slow in coming. But again, a lot of them come back down these kind of core issues of, you can't have a small military elite that runs the country and consumes the resources of the nation. You need to have you've got a growing population. You need to provide for your people, and if you don't, they're going to be on the streets protesting.
So let's tippy-toe forward. That didn't come out. Let us tippy-toe forward after the Arab Spring. People were put on alert.
Yeah.
A hot minute later, you have that little interval with George the second Bush.
Yeah.
Can we talk about that?
Well,
and move to Obama.
Yeah. So let me. Okay. So George W. Bush led the 2003 invasion, which went terribly awry. He succeeded by President Obama. Real change came in 2006 when the Democrats won the midterm elections. Then you have 2008 when Obama wins, and you have whatever, Democratic president, Democratic House, Democratic Senate. What's interesting from our perspective in terms of talking about the foreign policy of the region or American interest in the region is that when the 2011 uprisings happened, or let me back up. So when Obama comes into power, he's trying to reset American relations with the region, gives a very famous speech in Cairo in 2009, says all the right things. And the moment or the thought at the time was, that's all great in words, let's see what he does in practice. Implementing a progressive foreign policy and kind of shifting gears is really, really challenging because there's a certain amount of momentum. We still had troops in Iraq. We still have troops in Afghanistan. We're still committed to these alliance structures that are not serving the interests of the population. And there's many things that Obama tried to do. There's many things that he was unable to do. But the real moment of reckoning comes with 2011, with the uprisings.
Yeah.
What does he do? Whose side is he on? Is he with the status quo powers who've been American allies for a very, very long time,
right?
Or is he with the democratic forces in the street? And many people are critical that the Obama administration kind of waffled, in part because there were different voices speaking. The White House was issuing a release. Hillary Clinton was issuing a press release. There was another individual whose name I'm blanking on, but he was actually State Department envoy in Egypt, talking with Mubarak. And so they didn't really have a coordinated message. But from the Egyptian protesters' perspective, they really saw the U.S. as selling out democracy in Egypt. Whereas from the Saudi perspective, they saw the U.S. as throwing Hosni Mubarak under the bus.
Wow.
And in some respects, both were true because, we're trying to walk a fine line. And the Obama administration was talking to the Egyptian military saying, don't fire on your people. Don't do that. Don't go there.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a statement by Obama that basically said, Mubarak needs to step down. And so this has been a kind of a challenge that nobody, because Obama was trying to walk a fine line, because he was trying to get us out of Iraq, because he was trying to normalize relations with Iran, he alienated a lot of our traditional allies, the Israelis, the Saudis, the Egyptians.
Yeah.
What's interesting is you fast forward to the Trump era. When Trump comes in, he's totally lining up with the old guard. He's totally doing the opposite of the Obama thing. Saudi, he's basically cutting deals with the Saudi royal family, totally backing not just Israel but the Likud party in Israel.
Okay.
Totally.
Who they are?
Yeah, but last point. But he's also backing the Egyptian military entire 110%. The military government of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. So you see this kind of shift that while Obama was trying to have a very pragmatic, even-handed foreign policy, try to be a more neutral arbiter, if you will. What we see with the Trump era is a kind of shift back to the old order, standing by the old guard. I personally think it was a mistake. I think it's going to end badly, but for a variety of reasons, that's the path he pursued. Now, to answer your question, so if you look at Israeli politics, and I have a hard time keeping track of it these days, to be honest with you. I'm still. I know. Historically, there was kind of the Conservative Party and the Labor Party, or Likud and Labor, and Likud was was culturally conservative and economically conservative, party. The Labor Party historically represented the kind of Ashkenazi or the kind of old socialist members of the Jewish community that had come down from Europe after World War II. We're very very socialist. But the Likud party has been able to tap into a lot of the not the Mizrahi, well, the Sephardic community, a lot of the Jewish population that came from North Africa, Morocco, Iraq, elsewhere. But they're also much more conservative, and again these divisions have been have run through Israeli society since day one. And but what's really telling is labor was the faction, if you will, of Israeli society that was willing to reach out to the Palestinians to kind of cut a deal with the Oslo Accords. And we could talk about whether or not those were a good idea. Many Palestinians found those very objectionable. But the point was that at least there was something of a peace process under that era. When the Likud took over, they really had no interest in any kind of a two-state settlement. And what you've kind of seen since the 1990s is a kind of migration right within Israeli politics, center of gravity. And then really there's not. I mean, I whenever I talk to Israeli friends of mine, I was like, where is the peace party? I mean, where are they? And because there's groups like Crete, and they're definitely leftists. There's no two ways about it. There's some hardcore leftists in Israel that are very pro-Palestinian, but they're just not the dominant voice in Israeli politics. The dominant voice in Israeli politics is the settler movement, the Likud party, and that's really Benjamin Netanyahu's base. And not to complicate this discussion, but one of the challenges of Israeli political program or political system is that it's not a parliamentary. Let me phrase this. Its parliament is based on proportional representation, right, not a Westminster style representation. So what that means is if you get 20% of the vote, you get 20% of the seats. If you get 7% of the vote, you get 7% of the seats. Right. And it makes for a very fractured parliament, and it's really hard to form a majority. Whereas you can complain about the two-party system in the U.S. or the U.K., but who wins. Yeah, one party wins or the other party wins. And because of that proportional representation system, you've had small parties that have wielded disproportionate influence within the Israeli body politic. That's one of the reasons why you have the politics that you have in that society.
Well, lastly, for this time, because there will be a next time, and I will. I have a voice. I want you to just take a couple of minutes and talk about the nexus between American domestic policy and foreign policy.
Yeah. So one of the, I don't want to say tragedies, is because it's just a reality. But one of the challenges of American foreign policy is that, for the most part, Americans aren't that concerned about what happens in other parts of the world.
Exactly.
It's just this is America, right? I mean, we're solipsistic. We're focused on our own world, and yet the U.S. is still. I mean, even though we're I don't know if we're in decline or whatever, but we're still the dominant power on the planet. Dominant military power, dominant economic power. What we do has a disproportionate impact on other societies, whether we know it or not.
Right.
That means that when you look at the way in which American domestic politics operates, if you have certain focus groups or certain pressure groups or lobbyists that are organized and have money, they can shape American actions on any given issue, whether it's NRA or security or Israel.
Right.
Part of the reason why we have our policy towards Israel is so not just pro-Israel, but like pro-Likud, is largely because of the coalitions that have evolved in the United States, or particularly in Washington, of not just the Jewish American activists associated with AIPAC and the American Israeli Political Action Committee, but almost more importantly, the evangelicals, Christian evangelicals, are very, very influential. There's a group called Christians Unite for Israel.
Right.
They drive a lot of American foreign policy in the region. And then, of course, there are hawkish members of the foreign policy community, what historically been called neoconservatives. I just prefer to call them hawks. People like John Bolton. But they that in some respects that alliance has been disproportionately effective in driving American foreign policy, at least in terms of Israel. The Palestinian community is divided, or it's just the Arab American community is much more divided. They don't have the kind of resources. They're just not as well organized on Capitol Hill as they could be, and that gives what's been referred to as the Israeli lobby a disproportionate influence. Now,
but how would they better organize?
Well, so let me like one other comment before I answer that question. But you also have the military, for lack of a better word, military-industrial complex. I mean, there's huge amount of money being made selling weaponry throughout the region, and then you get the oil industry, ExxonMobil. I mean, there's just huge amounts of economic interest in perpetuating a foreign policy that's based on interest, not on values. And the one thing I keep coming back to again and again and again is, why are we spending so much money, policing the Persian Gulf, when we could be pouring that money into alternative energy and solar power and electric cars? Boom. And the short answer is, well, because there's still $30 trillion worth of oil sitting under the sands of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Iraq. And there are companies that want to make money out of perpetuating the status quo. And this is always kind of the challenge of any kind of change is there's all these vested interests who want to perpetuate the status quo, and yet those that would benefit from the status quo don't really know how they'll benefit yet.
Right.
And it's always a challenge to kind of make that argument, particularly if you're an American politician. And God bless Joe Biden, right? I mean, but I don't see him talking about we're going to have a revolutionary new policy.
No.
I mean, he may have a different policy, and I would argue I think he's going to have a new, new policy. But it's just you don't get elected by upsetting the apple cart.
That's true.
And if I can just throw out a kind of quick anecdote, one of the very, 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 very few times I've ever been on WTTW, I was on there to talk about, I don't know, some foreign policy debate between, I think, Obama and Mitt Romney. And our segment got kind of shortened because there was a congressional debate going on ahead of time. And I can't remember who the two candidates were, but they were from western suburbs of Chicago. They just were disagreeing on everything. I mean, you name it, opposite positions. Got to Israel. They both had the same position.
Yeah.
And it was kind of interesting. I mean, just again, as somebody who studied politics, that's curious.
Oh, we're going to have to end here. So I'm going to hold my question until next time.
All right, so next time we'll talk about Iran.
Yes. But I also want you to think about how we evaluate debate in the era of COVID. Okay. This is Critical Talk with what's left of Professor Al-Din, have no voice. And I have had a wonderful evening of learning with Professor Scott Hibbert. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.